I will introduce you quickly. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nelson today, whose lecture is entitled Seeing in Whiteout, Art, Abolition, and the Politics of the Visual. Dr. Nelson is currently director of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences, which is the Visual Arts Center at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Between 2016 and 2019, she served as curator at the same institution. She received a PhD in visual studies at UCSC in December of 2016, and she still is a lecturer at the same institution, teaching in the Department of Art History and Visual Culture. She received her BA in 2009 from Stetson University in Florida, and her MA in 2013, also from Santa Cruz. She is a specialist in 21st century global art, with a focus on contemporary art from Africa and its diasporas, and more recently, also really with a focus on African American art. Among her existing and forthcoming publications, I would like to highlight an edited volume with Gina Dent on abolition aesthetics, a monograph entitled Seeing in Whiteout on vision, race, and criminal justice system, also an article on perceptual conflict under the skin, feminist art and from the Middle East and North Africa today, and visions at the scene of trauma, looking at prospects in New Orleans, and maybe lastly, cultivating a collective museum. That was an exhibition catalog published in 2016. She is also working on several exhibitions right now, on an exhibition entitled Strange Weather, that deals with national histories of indigenous dispossession and slavery, and how that connects to the current United States climate crisis. Artists included in this exhibition are Redcliffe Bailey, Jacob Lawrence, Julie Merithu, Edgar Heap of Birds, and Lorna Simpson, for example. And she just curated the exhibition, and she talked about this a little earlier today, Bearing Freedom, Contemporary Art, engaging with issues of prisons and policing in the United States. Artists included were Sanford Biggers, Sadie Barnett, Donna Lawson, Hank Willis Thomas, and others. She also curated in the past a lot of exhibitions which happened outdoors. For example, in 2018, on Janet Cardiff and George Burris Miller, the show was titled Forest, and it dealt with memories of war, violence, and renewal. She organized and gave talks at several conferences at UCSC, the College Art Association, the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, and Council for African Studies Association, among others. And maybe lastly, she taught courses that include, for example, aesthetics of resistance, contemporary art from Latin America, colonial histories and legacies, vision and power in Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, and contemporary art in a global field. So please join me in welcoming Rachel Nelson to our group, and we are looking forward to your lecture.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'll share my screen. And thanks for that great introduction. It's so funny to hear all this stuff, always. So I feel like really I've just been sitting in my house for the last year. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my current nascent book project called Seeing Out, that looks at strategies artists use to engage the politics of the visual in the United States, and what I'm framing as the continued project of abolition and racial justice. In this project, I connect a visual history of abolition through Frederick Douglass to W.E.B. Du Bois's photographic archives, to artists like Jacob Lawrence and William Johnson, all the way, sorry, these are going fast, but we'll look at them again later. So all the way to artists like present artworks, like this one by Sadie Burnett, who creates these amazing graphite drawings out of the surveillance files the FBI kept on her father, a former Black Panther. My goal is to rally the past to not only illuminate history, but also current struggles. But I'm going to start in today and begin with the multi-sided exhibition, the multi-sided curatorial project that led to the book, which I hope will give you some tangible insights into how I approach my research and my curatorial practice, and how I got to the central problematic at the heart of seeing in Whiteout. Barring Freedom, an exhibition about art, prisons, and abolition, is currently on view between UC Santa Cruz and San Jose Museum of Art. I began thinking about an exhibition about contemporary art in prisons very early thinking. In 2015, in the aftermath of the formation of the Movement for Black Lives and the national uprisings against the police murders of Black people and other people of color that emanated out of Ferguson, as I need not remind anyone here. I was already writing about and researching artists who were grappling with the histories of prisons in the nation. I was also surrounded by faculty, current and emeritus, at UC Santa Cruz with deep relationships to abolition and prison reform, including writer and activist Angela Davis, popular culture theorist Gina Dent, Craig Haney, a psychologist who's testified on solitary confinement as torture to the Supreme Court, artist Sharon Daniel, and others. Barring Freedom grew out of the research and creative practices by UC Santa Cruz faculty and as a response to the state of our nation. But I also want you to stress, so you can understand how it ties to my current research on 19th and 20th century art and photography. It was also a response to an entrenched dynamic in the United States, the ramifications of which I have become increasingly focused on. And this is about how people see and understand what they see when it comes to oppression, and the roles that art can take in constructions of perception. To illustrate this dynamic, what we might call the relationship between sight and insight, or knowledge and perception, the following charts and graphs I'm going to show you are representative as what's been distributed via news sources, social media, documentaries, in-depth reporting, and all the like over the last few years. I tried to make the slides so you could see them despite our heads, but I know it's a bit of a problem. It has, for instance, been amply reported that the prison population in the nation has soared more than 500% in just 40 years to over 2 million incarcerated people, 2.2 or 2.3 million people to be exact. Most everyone knows we have the largest population in prisons, jails, and juvenile and immigration centers in the world, and that this is a rather recent phenomenon. There's also been large amounts of information about the stark racial and ethnic disparities of those incarcerated. Most of us know, some excruciatingly so, that Black men are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men. Hispanic men are 2.7 times as likely. Native American people are incarcerated over twice the rate of white people. And I'd be happy to talk about why they're noticeably absent from this chart. 1 in 2 Black transgender people has been to prison, and the fastest growing population in prisons and jails are Black women. Along the numbers and explicit racial injustice, the economic statistics about our prisons are perhaps less often discussed, but the facts are just as easily found. 57% of men and 52% of women in the imprisoned population lived in poverty prior to being arrested, despite a national poverty rate of 11.8%. These numbers always give me pause. Now, despite these statistics and their wide dissemination, many people remain far from shocked and dismayed about the discriminations within the criminal justice system. Instead, large swaths of the population, particularly those not directly impacted, have for decades treated prisons and policing, as well as the social and racial inequalities, not only in that system, but throughout society, as normal or even natural. Consider the recent poll, which was published in August, as actually a triumph about the raising understanding of structural racism in this country. It shows that 50% of white people, even today, after all that's unfolded in the last year alone, still don't believe that institutional racism exists. And I would add, this failure to believe is not the only problem. Most artists and activists have long assumed that the public would be motivated to fight inequality if only they knew the full extent of disparities. Yet the circulation of data and statistics about the racial and economic injustices of prisons and policings, the graphs I have shown you thus far included, have instead had troubling consequences. As sociologists Rebecca Hetty and Jennifer Eberhardt have explained, these facts have actually served to justify and rationalize systemic discrimination, with consumption of data about racial inequalities in prisons, for instance, found to perpetuate stereotypic associations about criminality and race. People see inequality and racism and use it to justify inequality and racism, in other words. This is what I've begun to think about in terms of seeing in whiteout. In the terminology of the weather, whiteout is the meteorological condition in which sunlight is blocked, reduced, and scattered by ice crystals and falling snow, water droplets and low-lying clouds, or localized fog. It's a condition that severely reduces visibility, leaving people unable to distinguish distinct objects and visual references. In whiteout, I quote, "The horizon disappears from view while the sky and the landscape appear featureless, leaving no points of visual reference by which to navigate." In the United States, the whiteout around racial injustices is similarly atmospheric. There's a persistent state of compromised visibility as the air is made heavy and thick, opaque, with what Martin Luther King Jr. in the era of segregation, that earlier time of state-sanctioned lynchings, Black church bombings, and brutal police brutality, called the dark clouds of racism. 60 years later, the clouds have not passed. There continues to be what, in King's famous summation, he called also a fog that allows people to remain unseeing to the terrible racist realities and settler colonial politics that structure the nation. What I'm calling whiteout is the visual phenomenon within the larger climate that theorist Christina calls simply, after Toni Morrison, the weather. So for Barring Freedom, working with co-curator Alex Moore, a graduate student research assistant at the IAS, we decided to ask how artists grapple with this whiteout and the dilemma of information and perception. How do the arts offer other ways of seeing, to use cultural theorist John Berger's turn of phrase, that allow people to see and perceive beyond this fog of social conditioning and bias? How do artists attempt to get people to look through the barrage of imagery, normalizing prisons and policing, to see the lives that are destroyed by these structures? And how can we work with artists to transform the space of the gallery into a space where those who've been the most impacted from these systems see their experiences reflected? I'm not going to talk much about the artworks from the exhibition, as this project has more information online than I would have ever thought possible a year and a half ago. When the pandemic began to shut things down last year, I assembled a team of graduate students and we created an incredibly deep website with artwork images, interviews with artists, study guides, and other materials. There's recorded conversations in the exhibition with Angela Davis and Gina Dent. And Gina and I also organized an ongoing online program of events called Visualizing Abolition. There's even a music series curated by Grammy Award-winning musician Terry Lynn Carrington. Here's a picture of the website. So information about this exhibit really abounds. I'll just show you a few images to give you a sense of the range of the artworks included, most done in the last 10 years. Opening the exhibition are Sanford Bigger's works memorializing people who've been killed by police, Infinite Tabernacle, and Bam Seated Warrior. Bam Seated Warrior, which is on the right, is part of a series of works for which the artist dips small wooden African sculptures purchased at thrift stores or tourist shops in brown wax before having them repeatedly shot by a range of firearms. What remains of the statues, pockmarked and battered, are cast in bronze, commemorating Black lives lost to police shootings. For Bam Seated Warrior, Biggers reproduced one of the small damaged wooden figurines at larger than human size, both transforming and exaggerating the violence done to the original. Infinite Tabernacle features videos playing across 5 screens of multiple figurines, splintering under a barrage of bullets. In the video, the figurines are not only riddled with bullets, but the violence also reverses, and in Rewind are made whole. Nearby is Dred Scott's video installation Stop, about the impacts of stop and frisk policies on Black communities. You're only seeing one side of the installation in this image. There's actually projections on 2 walls. 3 young men from Brooklyn face 3 young men from Norris Green, Liverpool. The men each look directly into the camera and recount the number of times they've been stopped by police. One says 62, one says 137. The work highlights the shared experiences of the men living on opposite sides of the Atlantic due to the policing targeting communities of color. This is no coincidence. In 1996, high-ranking police officers from New York and Liverpool met to discuss zero-tolerance policing strategies. Over the following decades, youth in the 2 communities were subject to a particularly high intensity of stop and frisk policing. Ashley Hunt's Degrees of Visibility, shown in the foreground of this picture, is a project documenting prisons, jails, and detention centers across the nation from public sites of access. Here's a detail of that. There are hundreds of images in this project, installed in stacks on top of crates and clipped to plywood boards, gesturing to an ongoing expansion of the US carceral state, present, barely visible in society. Chandra McCormick and Keith Calhoun's powerful works documenting labor conditions in the Louisiana State Penitentiary, which is called Angola, are also included. These images were taken between 1985 and 2014. The photographs of a prison called Angola and named after a country in West Africa make the history of our prisons abundantly clear. The prison is located on a former plantation named Angola because that was the country the majority of the people who were enslaved and worked the plantation were from. The prison remains a working farm, with now the majority Black population of the prison working these same fields. The photographs starkly detail the history that continues to produce the present. Yet, as Keith Calhoun explains, viewers struggle to believe that the photos represent the present moment. As he says, people always ask him, that was a long time ago, right? And he always responds, no, it goes on every morning. Every morning they got a line running in Angola. Barring Freedom includes work by people formerly incarcerated as well as other artists. This is an image of Cheryl Rollins' work documenting his performance dressed in a similar jumpsuit to what he was made to wear when incarcerated. In public walks, speaking engagements, and gallery spaces, Rollins wears the orange jumpsuit to provoke conversations around issues related to incarceration and address the prejudice that exists towards those currently or formerly incarcerated. The work intends to contradict the media's depiction of imprisonment and provide instead a window into the lives of those who've been impacted by incarceration. The last work I'll show you is Solitary Garden, a collaboration with artists Jackie Samel and Tim Young, currently on death row in San Quentin State Prison. This is an ongoing public sculpture and garden project at UC Santa Cruz, which is one component of the exhibition. The exhibition was also supposed to be in the gallery on the campus, but with the COVID, it hasn't reopened. For this project, students and volunteers exchanged letters with Tim to learn what he would grow if he could grow a garden. And then we together grew on his behalf. Tim has spent the last 21 years in a 4-foot by 10-foot cell and has not touched the soil in all those years. But his letters are full of dreams of a landscape without prisons, as Jackie poignantly puts it, and they give a powerful look into his life in solitary confinement. I think that what we hope to do in the project is to also give him a window out of his tiny cell. Now, I know this was a quick glimpse, and I'm happy to talk more about the exhibition in our conversations. But while I leave up this recent photo I took on my phone, so you'll have to excuse that it's dark, of Sharon Daniels' wonderful work, I want to turn now to how this exhibition has led me back in time. I think that McCormick and Calhoun's images actually do that work. When the pandemic began and we had to adjust our programming and create online access, I was telling the committee earlier that what happened next was pretty amazing. The minute the website went live, we had 100,000 clicks in the first week. We had over 10,000 people come to our online events in the fall alone, which for us is incredibly unusual. I have to say. And it was clear that there was a real massive interest and enthusiasm for the project. It opened with social distancing guidelines and is hosting pretty much capacity crowds. And one of the things that's grown more and more apparent to me as I work alongside the artists, scholars, activists, and musicians taking part in this program is that the enthusiasm with which people have greeted Barring Freedom is not just because of the moment we are in and all the crises of inequality that abound. It's because of history. Just as national history leads to mass incarceration, it also leads to the recent upsurge in protests and demands for justice. History leads here, with people eager and well prepared for nuanced conversations about inequality, prisons, and policing. The work that's being done by artists today hasn't risen out of a vacuum. And as I'm now beginning to think about through and seeing in Whiteout, contemporary artists are part of a broader progressive social movement of our times. And they're also part of a history of creative pursuits that took place within progressive social movements to shine a beacon through the fog that exists around racism. And tracing the history of art and resistance that in Barring Freedom we show only the most recent iterations of. We are at a crossroads, and it's time to map out the art and museum histories and models of education that have led to the current circumstances, as well as those that lead out of these entrenched systems. This requires us to ask important questions that I see are already being raised in your institution, and also to write, teach, and curate the histories that have the potential to remake society. How, for instance, can we trace the history from this work, Thomas Ball's Freedom Memorial, 1875, which of course is in the Kemper collection, celebrating Abraham Lincoln's issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, to the work by McCormick and Calhoun that I showed already? How do we begin to tell that complicated visual history and the impacts it has had? I was incredibly interested to see the essay from 2015 by PhD student Catherine Harnish beginning to do some of that work, critiquing how Ball's desire to memorialize Lincoln necessitated keeping the president at the center of the statue, in Harnish's words, and still exercising power by looming over the subjugated freedmen. However, there's more work to be done despite the critique. This statue, this monument, still carries power in society. Or perhaps even more complicated question, and I started to pose this before, how should the history be told from these amazing photographs in the collection by Edward Curtis, his portraits of Native Americans, of course, to the Standing Rock and Dakota Access Pipeline protests in 2016-17 to stop the construction of a pipeline on sacred burial grounds, which was also an environmental threat. Or maybe, or how can the visual history of settler colonialism that Curtis played a big part in also be traced to the fact that American Indians and Alaska Natives have been 3 to 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with COVID than white people, and their mortality rate almost twice as high? These are big questions, but ones that are urgent to ask. The circumstances we are in come out of a certain production of history, or as James Baldwin put it, history is not the past, it's the present. We carry our history with us. And art and visual culture has played no small part in this production. Yet as people like political theorist Cedric Robinson and historian Robin D.G. Kelly have compellingly argued, there's other ways to carry history and rally the past. I've returned to Robinson's Black Marxism and Kelly's freedom dreams repeatedly over the last year, needing to relearn how they both managed to gather the past around us in the name of liberation, connecting histories of struggles to tell the stories of freedom. In the history we carry with us, according to both thinkers, are the seeds of a new society. To quote Kelly, progressive social movements do not simply produce statistics and narratives of impression. Rather, the best ones transport us to another place, compel us to relive horrors, and more importantly, enable us to imagine a new society. For my small part in this larger project that's happening all around us, for Seeing in Whiteout, I've now turned to thinking more about the histories that can be constructed in art to further the struggle of eradicating racism in society. I want to draw out the connections between the current work of artists in Barring Freedom and the visual history of abolition more broadly, which we can claim as their lineage. Histories of social movements and art histories aren't always put together, but I do so to take part in creating the visual archive of resistance within the continued project of abolition. Of course, the obvious starting place is abolitionist Frederick Douglass and the speeches he gave about photography and abolition between 1861 and 1865, in which he discusses photography as an antidote to what he calls thought pictures. Speaking before the abolition of slavery, Douglass argued widely that the mental images people have were a substantial obstacle to the radical reformation of society that the end of slavery required. As Douglass put it, there are certain groups and combinations of facts which possess in large measure the quality of pictures. They illuminate and body forth phases of real life common to all. He goes on to say, there are pictures of the mind as well as of matter. In this short passage, Douglass diagnoses the problem of history in a country built on indigenous genocide, dispossession, and slavery. The production of that history necessitated producing an image of the world that, according to Douglass, even as slavery was coming to an end, continued to have a firm hold on the mind. The past hovers close in this appraisal, as in optics. Douglass, of course, eagerly embraced technologies that he saw as allowing the past to loosen its hold on the mind, the body, and the eye. He was the most photographed person in the 19th century. He used his own likeness to call into question the mental picture that normalizes slavery and the relations it predicated, and to provide a competing image, a thought picture not produced in slavery. As Henry Louis Gates writes, Douglass understood that the war against slavery and the obliteration or reconstitution of one's Black subjectivity assumed many shapes and forms more subtle than armed combat and the passage and enforcement of laws. So many of these operating in the realm of the symbolic and cultural imaginary. And the battlefield in which he could serve as captain, without peer, was that of the representation through photography of the anti-slave. An intrinsic part of the abolition movement begins also this long-running battle against the picture in the mind that bodes forth phases of real life. The earliest known image of Douglass is from 1841, and the latest is his deathbed portrait in 1895. Douglass offers a clear starting point from which to plot the incomplete visual archive of abolition and the roles of visual culture and social movements. As cultural theorist Deborah Willis would also remind us, Harriet Tubman's and Sojourner Truth's photographic portraits were also used to advance abolitionism. And also they took part in the visual self-visioning that Douglass was concerned with. Within the abolition archive beginning to assemble here, W.E.B. Du Bois's relationship to thought pictures and the visual politics of anti-racism is also relevant. In The Souls of Black Folks, W.E.B. Du Bois famously describes a double consciousness as the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Like Douglass, he situates a visual model of subjectivity at the center of what he calls the strange meaning of Black in the United States. As photography historian Sean Michelle Smith explains, for Du Bois, the African-American subject position is mediated by dueling images of Blackness, those produced by a racist white American culture and those images maintained by African-American individuals and communities. It's the negotiation of these violently disparate images of Blackness that produce the two-ness of Du Bois's double consciousness, what he calls two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals. While Smith identifies Du Bois' focus on the psychological space of Blackness, the activist and writer's work shows instead how deeply he was engaged with the realities of how those images, both mental and otherwise, also constructed real space, boding forth phases of real life, to use Douglass's turn of phrase, or to think with Fanon's later writing, creating the lived experience of Blackness. Consider Du Bois's exhibition at the 1900 Paris exhibition shown here. Du Bois assembled a remarkable collection of photographs for the American Negro exhibit, attempting to disrupt the images of Blackness produced through the eyes of others. Du Bois's photographs included 363 images into 4 volumes and presented in 3 separate albums.
The photographs were shown along a series of charts and graphs documenting the social and economic progress of African Americans since the Civil War, as well as a 3-volume set containing the complete legal history of African Americans in Georgia. Part of what Du Bois was doing in this exhibition of photographs and data visualizations was issuing a challenge to the vision of imagined criminality, which propelled the crime of lynching in the turn of the century US culture. By the early 20th century, the visual production of racism surged, from fictional creations such as Aunt Jemima, Uncle Rasta's, D.W. Griffith's 1915 film Birth of a Nation, and the circulation of lynching postcards. This is the battle Gates identified in relation to Douglass, a war of images and the vision of the nation as Du Bois steps right into it. The need to create an image of the anti-slave, as Emerson puts it, which Douglass was engaged with, quickly becomes for Du Bois and others the need to create an image of the anti-criminal. Du Bois's rich archive of images and graphs was in part a response to the rapidly expanding eugenics movement, which sought to identify criminality with certain racial and ethnic groups and claimed to assess intelligence through standardized tests and the use of visual technologies. There were ample images that were used to support the eugenics project, none of which I'll show today. However, as hope is starting to take shape, there's also a visual history of resistance that develops alongside this. Artists and activists continue to build on the abolition archive that Douglass and others began with within the shifting landscape of oppression. And while the advent of photographic and filmmaking technology energized what Dr. Willis historicizes as the Black Visual Reclamation Project, in which more and more people took part, sitting for portraits in the studios of Black photographers like James Vanderzee and purchasing their own cameras with which to, in Dr. Willis's words, document their own experiences. And I put up 2 great examples here. I think, of James Vanderzee's work. I think that more work needs to be done to look at the different visual and creative forms artists use to take on the visual politics of racism and incarceration. One of the problematics that I want to think through is still very speculative, so I hope you will bear with me a moment as I talk through some of the rough ideas. I'm interested in how photography, like the other kinds of information that Du Bois assembles, the charts, graphs, and diagrams, has often been able to really cut through the condition of whiteout. Remember at the beginning of the talk, I walked us through all those charts that have been compiled about mass incarceration. And I suggested that despite the facts of inequalities and the realities of racism being widely available, some people cannot see what's starkly in front of them. In fact, instead, those facts allow people to draw conclusions in favor of opposition, of oppression. What I'm trying to begin to articulate, and I'm thinking here with Lee Rayford, Sadia Hartman, and others, is how reality struggles to challenge reality instead of reproducing it. When Du Bois talks about double consciousness, after all, he's talking about 2 realities. The realities of white supremacy produce material conditions that combat understandings of realities that exist in opposition. This means that compiling the visual history of abolition means looking not only at photography, but maybe more centrally the work of creative practitioners who engage these issues in the realm of the imaginary. I want to question the different forms and strategies artists use to move beyond what people know and think they know, and to ask how artists use forms that don't look or act like knowledge. I'm interested in thinking about art and abolition, not as knowing, but as possibility. Always in my head is Angela Davis's insistence that, as she put it recently, art can help us do that work of imagining what we've never experienced before. It asks us to think about how our communities will have to be transformed and how our entire worlds will have to be different. Artists do that work. The arts can also help us understand what we're experiencing was also something imagined up. It was one dream, at least for some, of a society that for others is a nightmare. In the archive of abolition, artists from the era first known as the New Negro movement, later known as the Harlem Renaissance, and we can talk what it means politically to linguistically shift from a movement to a renaissance if we want to in conversation. But the images abound. This is one of Aaron Douglas's cycle of 4 murals commissioned by the Public Works of Art Project to decorate the section of the New York Public Library intended for research into Black culture. It's part of a history that could lead, should lead to a different present. Or Augustus Savage's amazing sculpture, very few of which remain. This photo of her with realization articulates powerfully within this archive. Savage in 1923 was offered a fellowship to Fontainebleau School of Fine Art in Paris, which rescinded its scholarship offer after discovering she was Black. Her work shows how this radicalized her, and she went on to radicalize others, opening the Savage Studio of Arts and Crafts in Harlem, which later evolved into the Harlem Community Arts Center, where she taught pro bono those wanting to learn how to paint or sculpt and fight inequality. Jacob Lawrence was, of course, one of her students, and this is panel 2 of his amazing 60-part series portraying the Great Migration, the flight of over 1 million African Americans from the rural South to the industrial North following the outbreak of World War I. One of the things about these images that makes Lawrence's work especially powerful for the Abolition Archive is how he tracks the role of the police and the criminal justice department within racist persecution. These are just some of the panels that look at the roles of the police and courts in keeping people in the South.
To Zoom conversation.
Laboring.
I don't want to keep that.
Sorry, just a sec. These are just some of the panels that look at the roles of the police and courts in keeping people in the South, laboring in the fields of slavery. Lawrence's images are struggle in action and part of the larger social movements against the racist labor politics sweeping the South. This is a resistance in paint. Charles White's commitment to creating powerful images of African Americans was unwavering over the course of his 4-decade career. White believed that art had a role to play in changing the world. As he put it, art must be an integral part of the struggle. It can't simply mirror what's taking place. It must also adapt itself to human needs. It must ally itself with the forces of liberation. The fact is, artists have always been propagandists. I have no use for artists who try to divorce themselves from struggle. In this image, the woman holds the child while a noose hangs from the tree and out the window behind them. Perhaps White's most well-known work, or at least until the traveling retrospective a couple years ago, is this mural. The central figure has chains around his wrists that also loop around the necks of 3 other figures, but the shackles on the figure's wrists are ready to be broken by the abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, Nathaniel Turner, Denmark Vesey, Harriet Tubman, and Peter Still. The last work I'll show, because I would love to have time for questions, are by Elizabeth Catlett. She famously said that art is only important to the extent that it aids in the liberation of our people. And I would say that I agree with the sentiment in its broadest strokes. For all we do in research, teaching, and curation, what could possibly be accomplished if not in the service of movement building and social justice? When looking at these images, all these struggles for liberation and placing them into a constellation of visual resistance and connecting them to the Black arts movement, to the international movements like Negritude or the amazing Festac, the World Black Festival of Arts and Culture in Lagos in 1970s. I think it's possible to see the world that shudders around us is struggling to emerge from the nightmare of oppression. And as Cedric Robinson and Robin Kelly would remind us, to step out of this twisted imaginary is we're going to require that we gather the past around us. I'll let Professor Kelly have the last word. Can you even read it? And I'll thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a fantastic talk. Enjoyed it very much. I think we have some time for questions now. So I don't know who wants to go first.
I have a question, but I don't want to go first.
could ask you how your talk went. So you could go first.
Mine was a tour of my collection, so it was fun. I'll just ask the question you sort of were inviting us to ask, which is, I'm really intrigued when you said, how do we understand, is there a distinction between the new Negro and then the reclaiming of it, or the renaming of it, reconfiguration of the Renaissance? I thought that was a really interesting question that you posed.
Yes, actually, I'm a little obsessed with it. So I'm like, why and when does it get changed to that? Because it was a movement, and a movement is a specific thing in US history. And Alan Locke refers at one chapter, says Renaissance in it, and then it gets shifted over to this other thing, and really becomes, it is about writing and poetry and art and music. But writing, poetry, art, and music is not separate from political struggle. And when it was called a movement, that was clear. And I really think that history has tried to undo that in some ways. I think that this is something that has been repeated many, many times, right, throughout history, is we want to compartmentalize. I've been using the whole conversation since we began our Zoom a long time ago. And again, this is a very imaginary we, it's just a substitute. But the people want to be able to put things in containers, to not be able to see the messy and the kind of real work that's being done. I think in art, this is particularly the case. People would like to think that they can go to art, look at art and see something other than like history is contracting. But of course, all art shows us something about the time that is being produced in, even when it tries to erase the evidence. So.
Do you think that the term Renaissance in some ways is an effort to sanitize it? It makes it's just, who objects to a Renaissance, right? Like what's, a Renaissance makes it safe. Do you think that had some part of it, that it sort of sanitizes and defangs it a little bit?
I would say there's something even more uncomfortable we could say here. Well, Renaissance, and remember, it goes from new to Renaissance. And Renaissance, of course, is a tradition of Europe. So it's shifting something that is new and is emerging, and the new possibility of a world, and putting it into a historic trajectory that power prefers.
Thank you.
Rachel, I have a sort of an unformed question, but I was really intrigued with the statement of your discussion of photography, and how you talked about you're just in the beginning stages of really working through the idea of how photography specifically is cutting through what you're talking about, this condition of whiteout. I wonder if you could position your argument in relationship to somebody like you mentioned, like Saidiya Hartman, who's her most recent book is really this sort of she's using I haven't read the entire book. I've read the beginning, and where she's using photography, and this sort of, I don't want to say, I'm missing the word, where we don't have these, reality struggling with reality. She's trying to give like an alternate type of look onto reality when we maybe don't actually have that documentation too. Maybe, sorry, this is a roundabout question, but I wonder if you can position your thinking maybe in relationship to some of these scholars like Hartman a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. And I'm always thinking, because Saidiya Hartman's so interesting in that book, because she's engaging with photographs, but they're not the photographs of the things she's talking about.
Yeah, exactly, right.
So that there's this, because I'm so interested in this, that we don't have the images of liberation necessarily, right? And one of the things that I'm trying to think about is that photography can't give us that image, or can't be seen in that register, because it's actually served all these other roles, right? And there's something about the way that that people take in information. They actually, what they do is they take the information and make it fit what they already know. It's like no meets no, knowledge meets knowledge, and just almost like hardens it, right? Where are the places where instead something unknown that works outside of knowledge actually takes it and makes this start to fall apart? I think this is the interesting thing to think about Du Bois as the two, right? And if they're two, they're real. You know, that's the thing that the both sides, because white supremacy, as I said, makes a reality that is those things. So I'm super interested, of course, in the work of Saidiya Hartman. I think that Carlos Mota is an artist that does this really well too, who try to take these little bits and archival nuggets and then take them out of the archive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Take them out of that form of knowing, take them out of all of that stuff and just switch them on their heads so that we don't know what's happening. I mean, when you read the Saidiya Hartman book, I keep thinking, there's parts where it's like, I feel like I know what's going to happen because it's like a movie I've seen or it's cinematic. My favorite parts in that book is actually when I do not know what's going to happen. Where I'm like, where are we going here? Because that's the point that I think that we all of a sudden have to lose back, you know, we have to move out of the part of our mind. Now, I don't know that art always does this, but what I really think, and this is that we've agreed that art does this as societies, right? We've demarcated art as this place where we come in and have experiences that we experience through our eyes, through our ears, through our bodies, not through our mind. So we're actually already trained to approach art in a way that I think some artists take advantage of really well.
Thank you.
I think I have a more general question also coming out of this kind of discussion. I would be interested, just because it's a larger question too, between, you know, of how you differentiate between engaged art on the one hand, so really a movement and art that is from the very beginning intentional to changing political positions, and what you just mentioned, art as an aesthetic experience that also just through this kind of perception on in a tactile or other, you know, through touching, through other experiences, may also be able to be transformative.
And I do think, I mean, I think, like I said, that I think that that's, you know, that one of the interesting things is, does the art carry that possibility in and of itself, or have we decided those are what it can do, right? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I know that as a culture, we've decided that that's something that art can do, can have these kind of aesthetic, you know, the aesthetic experience. And so that's the place that I'm looking for, is that actually I like if you saw the works that I talked you through in Acquiring Freedom were the more didactic works, but there's works in that exhibition that are really not didactic. I don't know if you saw the giant black ball that was behind the Dred Scott work, which was Sylvester Williams' tar ball. It's a 4-foot ball of sheets from the Virginia Correctional Institution that he's bound together and he's dipped in tar. There's little fly bodies, there's all these things. You know, it is minimalism, right? It's the phenomenological encounter with an object, right? Except for in this case, it actually kind of reminds me of like Eva Hess or something like that, where it's like, we have to question what that encounter is, who the bodies are that are meeting. Because of course, most of the things that in the idea of the aesthetic experience, who it is that's assumed to be having the experience is, there is an implied subject position there. There just, I mean, there is, I think, you know, and that in this case, we're asking, that is also being put into question. Who's having the aesthetic experience? What bodies are meeting? What is the historical context? I miss being around people. Like, I wish we were sitting in a room together.
Any other questions?
Rachel, I have one other question. It's kind of it's a more like specific question about your relationship with, sorry, I'm looking in my notes for the, you know, the, one of the works from the show that you were talking about, where you're working with one individual who's imprisoned. I can't remember what his name is right now, but how did that, Tim Young? I know that you've also written something, you know, you wrote something recently, I think maybe in the Brooklyn Rail that talked about that relationship. Can you talk about how that was initiated and maybe say a little bit more about what it means to your larger practice?
Yes, so I began working with Jackie Semel. Jackie Semel was one of the works that kind of led me into this. She had a project that she did beginning in, she worked on for 12 years. Herman Wallace, who was one of the Angola Three that's in the Angola prison, a political prisoner who was in solitary for 41 years. So this is a work that was shown at the First Prospect in New Orleans. So I saw it in this really weird context. And what she did was for 12 years, she wrote letters with Herman, and she asked him if he could build a house, what would the house be that he could build? He was a Black Panther. He was actually like, if I get out of a house, I want, I want freedom, I want resistance, I want to destroy. And she was like, no, let's do a project where you design a house and we can show people the difference between the 5x6 cell you're living in and the house in which you dream. So, there's all these beautiful letters and drawings that he made to her. They made a video, they made a model of the house that he narrates. You can listen to him, we show it in the exhibition. You can call, he died 2 days after he was released from prison, chronically ill after 41 years in solitary confinement. You can call and listen to him describe his house, which is amazing. And it's shown next to a cell, which is his cell. So it was made after a reproduction of his cell in this space. It was actually made after his drawing. So it's really interesting. It's got the pictures of the toilet and stuff like that he had drawn on in his handwriting. So when that project ended with his release from solitary confinement and his death, and Jackie had to figure out how she was going to keep working. In some ways within this, she was devastated, but she wanted to continue to work with people who were incarcerated on these two projects. One is for their freedom, and the other is to show people what is happening within our system, within the prison systems, and to give this really visceral look. So she's come up with this amazing project where she has institutions, art institutions, and education institutions pair with people who are incarcerated and do projects with them to grow gardens that they would want to grow. The garden, in our case, is around a sculpture of a solitary confinement cell, Herman's cell. It's always Herman's cell. And it's an aluminum sculpture, garden around it. Other instances, the cell itself is made out of something that's decomposable. So it goes away over time as you grow the garden, which is a lovely conceptual move. But because ours was going to stay up so long, we created a sculpture. And in that process, she introduced us to Tim Young. I think that Jackie and I have known each other for a long time. We're both lived in New Orleans, we're in that stuff. So I think she also kind of was like, yeah, Rachel, you're going to do this project. Here's somebody who's innocent on death row. Like, you have that one. And so it's been incredibly interesting. I'm Tim, and I've been working with Tim now for about a year and a half. We write together. So we have a writing practice. We are working on a bunch of stuff. On a class with a professor, actually with Sharon Daniel, who's one of the artists in the exhibition, is doing a making an exoneree class, making an exoneree, where she's working with students to look at all the different aspects of his case. From that, of course, now I've begun to have relationships with other people on the inside, and also to work with kind of trying to connect, right? Because everybody on the inside needs somebody on the outside. There's this whole thing. But also I think that I've just really learned a lot about what curating is, what it is we're supposed to care for. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to go, I just have to say that it's definitely changed the way that I have approached my work entirely. Because I'm like, there's a responsibility in what we do that I was well aware of. I'm very, socially engaged and stuff like this. And this actually helped me be able to articulate it, what it is we're caring for. When we're caring for objects and ideas and histories, we're also caring for people, and how we can broadly think about that. So I would say that Tim comes with me everywhere I go, and it's just part of my life. I'm his person on the outside, as we call it. But it's also has started lots of lovely things. I'm working with students. They're doing lots of great.
Great. I think we have time for one last question.
I have one, unless others have questions, but So I have to say that I was being a Zoom voyeur on your bookcase, and this just arrived for me. So I was very excited to see this also on your
Amazing.
bookcase. So we're doing some hiring in data bias, and one of our candidates recommended this to me. So I'm excited. I really love the range of your citational practices. I mean, these are just really, I think it's really smart. And I love the way you pulled this together into a coherent narrative. I'm really curious about the images that you chose to show us of Aaron Douglas, Augusta Savage, Lawrence, Charles White, Catlett, all artists, Black artists who are very explicitly calling for, I don't know if they're calling for a canon, but they're certainly calling for a movement, right? A political movement. And so I'm curious then, how do you situate in maybe more contemporary artists, Black artists who are clearly working as Black artists, but either are doing more conceptual work like a David Hammond's, or are flaunting that Black tradition like a Kara Walker. So I'm curious, how do you kind of locate some of these contemporary works that aren't falling within that, that classic Black liberationist politics of art tradition?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that was one of the points that I was trying to make, is that how do we think about the artists that are working now as also part of social movements? So, like that, and maybe some of them, it's interesting because talking to Hank Willis Thomas, it's been over the years, it's been incredibly interesting about his relationship to it, because now he can articulate in a way that he couldn't 6 years ago, or I think that maybe all of us couldn't, right? That we're in a changing world. So this isn't at all a judgment, is what I'm saying, that this is a thing where he can locate himself with as part of a social movement, right? Or Sanford Biggers, that we all are learning a new vocabulary to recognize that we're located within it. With Kara Walker, Glenn Ligon, who I got to spend kind of a lot of time 2 years ago, that I'm thinking about this. They're always, people are working for political change, but maybe we didn't know what movement was we could attach to, right? But it's very clear now. And maybe,
well, but Willis seems to me to be someone who, I mean, his work is squarely within the Black political tradition. Not all of it, but
not all of it. Yeah.
I mean, huge chunks of it are within it. It's conceptual, but it's very much within that tradition. And I would say Biggers is as well. I mean, Hammond's, it's a you can certainly, I think you could certainly locate him within it, but it is more, he's not doing, depiction of civil rights as far as I've seen. And then it's more subtle.
Well, and I want to figure out how to put all that together. I mean, that's my thing, is that you don't have to be, I took a shortcut in some ways.
I mean, are there different traditions, I guess is what I'm getting at, rather than one holistic arc of a Black political tradition?
Yes, I would definitely say so. And I would say that there's different forms. And one of the things that I don't want to do, and I would say that all of my my intellectual interlocutors and all my mentors and all my voices right now are like yelling at me. I've got Robin Kelly who's like sitting next to me going, Rachel, this is not continuous. It's not continuity. We're not looking at one thing that stays the same and just keeps adding on. Struggle is not the same. Mass incarceration is not the same as slavery. If it is, then how can we understand the fact that 85% of people in prisons do not work? Because the thing is, if we think it's slavery, then we think we can just fix the labor politics and the problem is gone, and it's not that, right? So it changes forms, and I think we have to allow art to change forms too. And I did take a shortcut, and I actually thought on this talk, I was like, I know that I'm taking a shortcut because it's much more complicated than this. I'm telling a story that's too straight, and that all my people that sit in my room with me, as we all have our people, are saying it's got to be this, and right. There's a lot of pluses in this, because we aren't living in a history that moves without change. It moves it's changed so radically so that we can have, a Black president and have mass incarceration continue to rise. So we can have, all these different things. And so we need to track the way that artists were subtle to move with it.
I think that was a great last sentence.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. There was a wonderful, very interesting lecture and a great discussion afterwards. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow again, Rachel.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for being so generous and listening.